Hello and welcome to the Womb-Centered Healing Podcast. I have Zoe here with me. Thank you so much for joining us, Zoe, for the Ancestral Healing Podcast series. Zoe and I were chatting about generational healing, and that's how we got to the idea that you ought to come on the podcast with me. So for this series, so please introduce yourself more and share about your journey with ancestral healing and how that is for you.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. So my name is Zoe Etkin, and I am a newly retired birth doula and postpartum doula who is transitioning into doing more what I'm calling postpartum transformation guidance. And we can talk more about that certainly later. But in addition to my work with families, especially with mothers, I also have a background in poetry. So I did my MFA in writing at Cal Arts almost 10 years ago. Can't believe it's been that long. And so, coming from a poetry background and then moving into women's health and womb work has been a really nice sort of coming together of a lot of things that I think were already in me before I knew that I was a womb worker. And I was writing about the body and about sexuality and womanhood in different ways, and the generations of people in my family. And then once I became a doula, I was taking a training and had this realization when they were talking about how the egg that is you is inside of your grandmother, because it's inside of your mother as a fetus. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. We're just so interconnected in that way through this womb space. And so in about 2016, I think it was, I started writing this book called The Birth and Death of Girl. That was really about me coming into my adulthood, into my womanhood, and wanting to move from that into being a mother. And so through that book, I explore, my childhood, my experiences with my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, who I was fortunate to get to be around until I was a teenager when she passed away in her 90s. So that was pretty special to have all four generations, or three generations. I'm thinking of my future daughter already, around at the same time. And then in that book, I sort of call my daughter in, and she was conceived not long after I wrote the book, which was pretty cool. So that's sort of what I'm up to, and continuing to write and write more books about motherhood and the womb. And all that other work that I do. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. And it's making me realize that I'm probably going to publish this episode in the other, I have a second podcast called Writing from the Womb. And
how are we not been friends for this?
I don't know, but I'm glad we are now. And so that the folks that are following that podcast is usually guests I have on that podcast are usually authors, and we read excerpts of our writing and talk about the process of writing from the womb as a source of intelligence, as a way of knowing, as a way of understanding the world. And as many authors discover, that poetic voice is a very different voice than the intellectual voice. And I've tried to write intellectual books about womb healing, and I end up like, I can't do it. It just doesn't happen. And so, we can get all scientific, we can get all clinical in our understanding, but it doesn't make for very enjoyable reading unless you're really geeking out scientifically, which I can totally do. I'm in biology classes and I'll geek out with the textbook, you know what I mean? but then it translates into this poetic experience, this experience that includes the emotional aspect, the spiritual aspect, the connectivity, the mystical aspect. And as I might have mentioned to you, and listeners have probably heard me talk about my biomystical womb healing work, biomystical womb apprenticeship, where we start to discover the weaving together, and we start to nurture and acknowledge and live in the weaving together, the wholeness of our biology with our mysticism. And the womb feels like the very central place where that occurs, because as we know, as womb bearers, or as we can feel, especially those who may have children, or we were all born from a womb, that's a very mystical experience when we really allow ourselves to experience all of that. And unfortunately, it's been stripped of those qualities by a lot of the ways that it's treated in medicine and clinically and like that. And then there's this mystery as to why there's so much emotional and psychological trouble around all of these, all the cycles of the womb and like this. And so I'm sure as a doula, birth and postpartum doula, you have loads of experience with this. And I'd love to hear about what you've noticed as a birth and postpartum doula in your, but also in yourself, in your own experience of birthing a child. What kind of generational healing needs to happen in order for us to not just continue to perpetuate the unhealthy patterns that we may have inherited? And, you know, it's not to say anything bad about our parents. They, you know, we're suffering from generations of trauma from society's, you know, misconceived notions of what, you know, what we're about as human beings. And we're at a crisis point of needing to recalibrate in order to survive as a species on this planet. And so I feel like, as listeners know, and you're getting to know me, that this womb-centered healing, reorienting to the center of our life generative powers, and the wisdom of the womb is an important guiding energy and resource and center for us in reclaiming life generative lifestyles and ways of being and ways of parenting. We need to change the ways that we've become parents. We need to acknowledge the biomystical aspect of this process of being born. We need to honor it as not as like the original sin, right? This is like so misinformed, and that whole concept was designed just to control the masses by the wealthy elite, right? And so we need to scrap that idea and get back to this, you know, collectively, just like that. We're just going to go like that, right? Wave our magic wand. We're just going to, come on, let's do it right now, Zoe. Woo!
I'm somewhere. I don't know where it is right now.
Okay. So, but, you know, I just feel like your work and, you know, our work as doulas, and especially postpartum, like learning how to care for the mother. This is like one of the core wounds, that we were all raised from mothers who were not cared for, who were not honored, who were not respected, who were abused and exploited. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes the norm.
Yeah.
And that becomes perpetuated throughout the generations. And so my spidey sense is telling me that your work is very much addressing this, and I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I want to address a few things that you said. The first that I really resonate is the sort of the weaving that you were talking about of the biology and the more mystical. And I think that's a really important part of my work in general. The word that I like to use for that is embodied, you know, and I have this embodied like philosophy that I teach. I train other doulas now, which is really exciting. And also in my childbirth classes, this sort of acknowledgement of, what is the evidence-based thing? What does the science say? Reminding us that we are mammals and that our nervous systems don't know that we're not like the same as some of our, our cousins in the primate kingdom there. And then the sexuality that is inherent in all things. That's another tenet of mine. And then cultivating that relationship to your body's inner voice. Like that's definitely really important for me to promote to doulas and to the families that I work with. But I think while it's not explicitly taught in the doula world, that we're all working in this space, and sometimes when you don't know that, I think that there's a lot of disservice done in the doula community to families who are not, for doulas who are not being taught the more spiritual or mystical elements of the work. And I think that happened because doulas wanted to be seen as legitimate, and so they sort of mainstreamized themselves, but that just never felt good to me and didn't sit right in my body as I'm doing this work. And I've been a doula now for 10 years, many of which were before I was a mother myself, but I knew even then, through my own experience being mothered, and I'll kind of talk about that as well, but that there was a bigger picture going on here than just, this is people having babies, that's just what we do, like, yes, it's mundane in a sense because it's happening all the time everywhere right now. Babies are coming out of bodies all over the world, and it's extremely profound. I mean, you're making a human being and someone's soul is entering the world. Like that's, like I just was like, wow, this is such a big inner journey. Why are we not learning about that? And so that then has moved to the forefront of what I do over time. And now even more so as I'm moving into this postpartum and motherhood transformation guide work, where I'm spending less time with clients. I'm not doing as much, practical care in the home of cooking and things like that I typically do, because I have other doulas who can handle that. I really want to be there to hold that container for them to explore their identity changes, which, that encompasses so much. And in that, we are looking at their own generational experience, trauma or goodness too, because that certainly is there as well. And then talking about our collective womb trauma that we all carry, because of, like you're saying, when menstruation and birth and all of these womb experiences were taken from us and put into this medical context that was created by men. And I don't mean to be a man hater by any means, but but that's just the truth of the history. A lot of trauma was inflicted upon especially Black bodies. Thinking of Dr. Sims, who invented all of these torturous devices that are still used today, like the speculum, and doing unanesthetized experiments on Black enslaved women. We are all carrying that. Anyone who has a womb is carrying that inside of us to some degree. And I think we need to talk about that. And I think, maybe the average client that I'm working with isn't really engaged in that conversation, most likely. I have a lot of clients who are, maybe not necessarily spiritual or just not even aware of some of the history. But when I talk about it with them, they're like, oh, I get it. It makes sense. They can feel that. And then we talk about, what was it like for you to be raised? What's your relationship with your mother, her mother to her mother, and kind of looking back through to see how we get to the place we are now, to figure out who we want to be as a mother or as a person. And that I think so many of us get locked into this, like, I'm a mom now and this is my whole world, and then feel very bad from that, feel very locked in and very going through a grief through that experience. And so what I hope to do with clients is it's like, let's look at all these things. Let's go back and go back and go back. And then as we do that, come back to now and what's here and what is true of you and who are you deep inside. And then how can you find ways to slowly pull that back into your life as you get farther from the time of birth.
It's hard. It's hard because as you're saying that, when this grief that comes up for women becoming moms, this postpartum depression that's just kind of a given nowadays. If we look at the spiritual reasons, the sociological reasons for that, okay, and we've talked about a little, I just want to spell it out for listeners here, because there's a surface narrative that, oh, congratulations, you had a baby, oh, you're fulfilling your purpose as a womb bearer, oh, and yet underneath the surface of that what's not acknowledged, what's ignored is the status of the mother in our society, the complete lack of support for motherhood in our society. I mean, this is a chart all the time. I see these charts that show all the other developed countries in the world and how many weeks, months, or years of paid maternity leave are mandated by the government for employers to give mothers and fathers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the United States is always at the bottom with a big fat 0 next to it. Okay. So, and that's not to say that those other countries also have a lack of support for mothers. They do also have a lack of support for mothers, but at least they get paid maternity leave, right? And so, right. And so, and then the birthing practices of having oftentimes very traumatizing experiences, even with doulas and midwives in place, because of all kinds of myriad factors and all that generational wounding. I know my grandmother got ether, which was also called twilight sleep, which put her and my mother in a place of a basic unconsciousness that is far reaching in its effects neurologically and the development of the child from that moment on, and the development of the bond between the mother and the baby. And it was the beginning, and there was all this shame, like, even though it was the whole purpose of a woman's life to have babies, they would wear, when my grandmother was pregnant, she told me about wearing trench coats to hide the pregnant figure.
Yes, I remember hearing about that. Yeah,
because it was such a shameful thing,
right,
to be pregnant. So there's this like dual thing of, on the surface, oh, congratulations, you had your baby, and make sure nobody sees you breastfeeding your baby. And as soon as there was formula, my grandmother was like, I'm not breastfeeding anymore. It was a shameful thing. And
right.
And I didn't get breastfed adequately because of the misinformation that was common at that time, and still to this day, promoted by the formula companies, that was misinforming, and that's where the training information for doctors comes from, is the formula companies about breastfeeding, so that many people around the world are still getting egregiously incorrect information about breastfeeding that deliberately sabotages the proper development of breastfeeding, and so that they will the babies will end up needing to go on formula. And that's what happened to me. And the biomystical importance of breastfeeding and establishing that bond with the mother, and the biological importance and the emotional and spiritual importance, is just like swept under the rug and just deliberately ignored for the profits of.
Yeah, so hard. Like, that topic is really hard because I do, I support so many mothers who want to breastfeed and have been set up in the birth at the hospital with kind of getting on a trajectory that doesn't align with actual realities of how to make breastfeeding work. So I'm often having to kind of repair the initial kind of process that happened for them by just helping them understand how it actually works, because it's not only not just we know it's not a schedulable kind of thing. It doesn't work that way, but we also know that it is more than food. Mm-hmm. And that once the whole formula thing happened, it kind of turned things around where breastfeeding even still is kind of seen in this way of like, well, it's to feed the baby. And it's like, yes, but it's a relationship. And so I always try to emphasize that to my clients, that this is a relationship that has two people involved, and there's two sides of that. And then it serves so many more purposes than just feeding them. And then also feeding is loving in a way too, I mean, feeding a person food that you cooked is also, a way of loving them. And so
feeding a baby formula is also can be a very loving exchange, not to put any pressure or aspersions on mothers who end up needing to feed their baby formula. My mother, despite all of that, still imparted to me that I was unconditionally loved. And somehow,
I certainly encourage with bottle feeding clients to do it skin to skin, or, hold the baby in certain ways that are still very bonding. And no matter how you feed the baby, love is there. But I do think that we're in this place where people are feeling shamed about either direction. People are feeling shame for doing it, feeling shame for not doing it. And we're not really meeting people where they are with that. And it's really hard to see that. But I did want to speak to this sort of, talking about your grandmother and really relating to that from what I've heard about my own grandmother's birthing experiences. She had babies in the late 40s. My mom was born in 47. So, and she was born in a small clinic in a rural town in Tennessee. But my grandmother was put under twilight sleep. And, it's like, you don't even know if that's your baby that you're getting when you wake up. It's very traumatic, I think, that experience, and carries through. And then, you're talking about the way they would dress back then, and then it's like celebrated and hidden. And I think we're still really there. I think we're still really in a dichotomy space with it, and a binary space with mothering. And I'm so done with binaries. I keep talking about this with like everyone, but I'm just so done with them because they've become completely damaging to our society in every way, and are totally pushing people away from each other. And I'm over it. And I'm really over it in this space because this is where I'm, with people so often. And I'm often talking to my clients about, like, in their identity, as a mother, it's like we have these archetypes, right? Of there's this virginal mother who is exalted and put on this pedestal, and oh, how did she even get that way? She's so, perfect, and we pay so much attention and care. And then as soon as she becomes a mother, it's like, who cares about her? We're all about the baby in this culture. And babies are great. I love babies. So they totally deserve lots of praise, but the mothers are left, to the wayside. And then at the same time, feel like they can't be sexual. They can't be in their power anymore. They can't be more than one thing, and I just really feel like that comes down to the lineage, right? Where, grandmothers such as my own, we're sort of this 50s housewife kind of archetype. Like, she wasn't wealthy, so she wasn't sitting around in pearls, like Beaver Cleaver's mom or whatever. But that energy in the 50s, I think, is carrying through in a way of like, you got to go all in with mothering. That's what you do. You just give it everything, and there's nothing else. And it's this sort of martyred version of being a mother. And then I think, the next generation of moms was a little bit more like, certainly influenced by maybe the hippie movement and sort of that kind of thing, but also we've got the working moms now, and it's like, that's, they're absent and they're kind of doing the man's world thing and the shoulder pads and the whole thing, you know?
Well, that was all kind of a rebellion from that martyred mother. And yet it's still in there, because even as the working mom, they're still coming home and having to do all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the child rearing, and being responsible for all of it, because the missing piece of the other parent, usually the father, taking responsibility, picking up responsibilities as well, still hasn't happened for many people.
Right. And I think we're at this edge with it where it's like we're feeling that it's not working for us. And I see my clients really wanting to be able to, it's not that you want to, you know, what's that term that people use? It's like, you know, do it all or whatever. It's not that we want to do it all, because that's horrible. And that's just what you're talking about, which is like having a full-time career and a full-time, you know, complete mothering experience. I think people are trying and fighting, you know, against these barriers that exist in this culture to do something else, you know, and that we have a deep desire to do something else, that we want to be a whole person after we become a mother, but society doesn't really support that. And again, one of the things I keep just being like about is capitalism, because I really think that's the reason for a lot of these things. It's like the thing to blame for me is like, well, that's why, you know, like the whole way that work is structured in this country is around male persons going to work with the housewife at home to take care of everything else. And we still do it that way, you know, as if that
Even
works.
though most people can't make enough in a 480-hour work week to support a family. And so then both parents have to go out, and then who's going to do the unpaid labor of taking care of the kids in the home and all of that?
It's a structure that is rapidly in collapse, I think. And it's really scary because we all want to do right by our children, and how can we hardly have time to, you know. How do we break these generational cycles? You know, I think there's ways to work within the, you know, structure we are in, but it's almost impossible and takes so much energy and work to really think about and even acknowledge. And so many people, you know, are just not there with it. And if no one else talks to people about these things, I'm like, I'll be that person, because somebody's got to do it. And these moms deserve somebody telling them that they're important, and what's important to their inner being and what makes them happy is valid and matters, you know.
And what's making them upset or unhappy is a valid concern and needs to be addressed, right? That you know, so often the complaints of the postpartum mom are just brushed off as a hormonal response, and then she's gaslit by, you know, family members, and oh, you should just be happy because your baby is, you know, and so the truth is that her wounding is valid and needs to be tended to. Her need for care, for something different, for something more, is valid. And so I'm so grateful that you, among other postpartum doulas, but that you're taking it to this new layer of this new level of saying, we need to tend to this on all levels. It just gives me so much joy to hear about you developing this work, and that this is moving forward, and that you have all these wonderful skills and abilities and ability to articulate all of this in such a clear way, and in a poetic way as well, because it ticks all my boxes for sure. So I'm so grateful. And I could ask you a gazillion more questions. I'm sure we could carry on with this conversation all afternoon. However, our time that we had planned is quickly coming to a close. And perhaps you'll come on again and talk more about your work and whatever topic we're inspired in about on that day. I mean, this whole thing with why is capitalism such a problem? Or, you know, how do we address the the racial inequities in the birth industry, and how did you address that as a doula and as a postpartum person and a doula, a postpartum care person? How do we address these things societally? These are all the questions that are coming up for me. And I'm kind of like you, it's like somebody has to talk about these things. And somebody's got to put this conversation out there so that it can reach people who are feeling so like not understanding why they're feeling the way they're feeling when nothing in the world is validating it for them, that we can be that voice of validation for them. Is like, it makes complete 100% sense why you feel this way.
Yes.
Because these systems are in this way and they are hurting you. Yeah. And let's get creative. Let's activate our womb power of wisdom and creativity and life generation and regeneration. Let's activate that to come up with a new way. I mean, our womb bearers were the creators of societal organization in the beginning. We're the creators of money to make sure everybody had their needs met in the beginning. This is my insight from what I've learned, but also my own intuition about it, is that, you know, all of these things that have become problematic that we're talking about were originally created by womb bearers to make life easier and better. And then they've been twisted and used for exploitation and turned into these abusive systems. So if we could create them then, we can certainly create that now. So the womb-centered healing and the approach, the work that you're doing, and hopefully the work that I'm doing in this conversation can inspire us to create something new.
Yes.
Eventually, so that we can get out of this mess that we're in.
Oh,
oh my goodness. So thank you so much. So if folks want to get in touch with you about your work, how might they do so?
So my website is thememphisdoula.com, and doula is spelled D-O-U-L-A. That's my main source of connection, where if people want to find the books that I've written and the forthcoming books that I have coming out, because I have, so the one I referenced earlier, The Birth and Death of Girl, that's available on Amazon if you just search that and Zoe Etkin. And I have another poetry book called The Mother Myths coming out, and also an ebook that is called Who Am I Now? A postpartum identity journal. So that will be available soon as well. And then I'm available for virtual coaching for early postpartum moms, and also for mothers of any stage. I'm saying a year to 20 years postpartum, anyone who feels like they want help finding who they are again after their motherhood journey has unfolded for however long, that is available as well. So I would love to work with anyone who feels called to that, and anyone who needs doula support in the Memphis area. If you're listening, certainly me and my team that I have are available for that as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And listeners know that if you want to learn more about what's happening at the Womb-Centered Healing Temple, you could go to wombcenteredhealing.com and sign up for the newsletter there, and keep an eye out for, if you signed up for this podcast series, you have a specialized newsletter. Keep an eye out for updates about the series and what's coming up after that. So thank you so much for joining us. Any last words of wisdom before we close out?
Well, I just appreciate this conversation with you and getting to know you better. And I'm always happy to learn of more people who I feel so kindred with. So I'm just really glad to know about what you're doing even more, because we've been following each other for a little bit. And I'm excited to, I think I'm going to sign up for that too, because I don't think I'm following your newsletter. So okay. I think, but I look forward to more conversations with you as well. I think we could talk about a lot of things. So I've had a great time.
Me too. I had a great time too. So listeners, keep an eye out for part 2 with Zoe. All right. Take good care. That's all for now. Until next time.